Hello students, this is Dr. Martina Hesser, and today we will talk about Chapter 19, Italy and Spain in the 17th century. Before we start to talk about the arts, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in that century and the style that we usually use to describe the artworks that we will see. The style that we use to describe is called Baroque, and the term Baroque comes from the Portuguese barroco, which is used to describe an irregularly shaped pearl. So it kind of tells us a little bit about what type of art we're going to see. Things that might be a little bit off-center, that might be a little bit kind of beyond our usual aesthetics a little bit. One political event is really interesting in the first half of the 17th century, and that is the 30 Years' War, which is a conflict that starts in 1618 and goes until 1648. And it's a religious war against where Catholics fight against Protestants. And really most of the European countries, and even countries that are not part of Europe, took part in this. Spain, France, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Poland, and even the Ottoman Empire. So those would be the Turks. The 30 Years' War ends with the Treaty of Westphalia and brings religious freedom. This brings with it the realization that probably we can't kill the proponents of the other faith, and maybe we should make peace with the fact that there are people out there who might not agree or who might have a different brand of Christianity that they would like to follow. Another thing that starts to change the world around is mercantilism, which is an economic system that really looks at the world as a marketplace. And by the 17th century, we have things like colonialism start to flourish a whole lot. We see the explosive use of commodities that are being traded for a long time. For example, sugar, coffee, and tobacco in Europe. Now, if we talk about the arts, we should talk about this project here, which is the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral. And by now, the beginning of the 17th century, we have an architect in charge. His name is Carlo Maderno. He is an Italian-Swiss architect who had moved to Rome in 1588 with 4 of his brothers to assist his uncle Domenico Fontana. In Rome, Maderno first designs the facade of Santa Susanna, which won him the attention of Pope Paul V. And in 1603, Paul V appointed him as chief architect of St. Peter's. Maderno was forced to modify Michelangelo's plans for the basilica and provide designs for an extended nave with a palatial facade. The facade, which was completed in 1612, is constructed to allow for papal blessings from the rich balcony above the main door. This forward extension of the basilica brought with it an extension of Michelangelo's Greek cross into the present Latin cross design. In the beginning of the 17th century, the clergy had rejected the plan for this building in the Greek cross design because of its connection with pagan buildings. So that means buildings from the Roman period in this case. Paul V had Maderno add 3 nave bays to the earlier nucleus. This also underlined the symbolic distinction between laity and clergy. The design has been criticized because it blocks the view of the dome, as you can see here. So we're standing right in front of the facade and we hardly have a view of the dome at all. Now here we're stepping back all the way to the other end of the plaza in front of the structure. Here we see it a little bit, but we still can't see the drum of the dome. The now longer nave pushed the dome further back, and the effect that Michelangelo had planned, a structure pulled together and dominated by the dome, did not materialize. Visitors must move further back to be able to see Michelangelo's vision, as we're doing right now in this photograph. The facade is wider than the structure behind it, which creates a theater-like effect. This coincides with tendencies that emerged out of the Council of Trent during the times of the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation fostered ideas to turn Holy Mass into a more dramatic event. This stage-like setting of the facade would certainly create a wonderful stage setting for the papal blessing that was to be performed on the middle balcony. The new facade has projecting columns and pilasters that cast dramatic shadows. These strong shadows cast by the columns add to the sculptural effect of the facade. Now, let's look at the plan drawing here. Now, here we see the original design up in the top with the Greek cross. And here we see the three bays as they were added. And then we have our wide facade that is actually wider than the church behind it. And then we see the planning of the large plaza in front of the church. And this was planned by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Now, Bernini was an Italian artist who worked principally in Rome. He was the leading sculptor of his age and also a prominent architect. In addition, he painted, wrote plays, and designed middle works and stage sets. He also worked as an urban planner, and this is what we see him do here in this plan drawing. Bernini's architectural works include sacred and secular buildings, and sometimes their urban settings and interiors. He made adjustments to existing buildings and designed new constructions. Among his most well-known works is the Piazza San Pietro, which we see here, the piazza and colonnades in front of St. Peter's, and the interior decoration of the basilica. The plaza itself shows the preferred shape of the Baroque period, the oval. Two massive colonnaded walkways embrace the faithful on their way to church. These two wings are sometimes referred to as the welcoming arms of the church. They underline the intent of the Counter-Reformation to pull the masses back to the one true faith in Rome. Here we see an aerial view of the plaza in front of St. Peter's, where you really have a nice impression as to how these two arms start to come out, grow out of the facade, and around these thousands of people as they are gathering in front of the church. You see on the right also the Vatican Palace, which is where the Pope lives. But Bellini also does work in the interior of this church. Now, let's talk a little bit about the changes that were made to the architecture. This was Donato Bramante's original plan from 1506 of the Greek cross that looks like a snowflake almost. This was Michelangelo's rendering, where he solidifies the outline and the silhouette of the structure. Still, we have a central plan building here. And here we have the elongated nave that we see here. That's made longer. 3 bays were added on the west side. Now, Gian Lorenzo Bernini also works for the interior of this church. And here we see his baldacchino. St. Peter's baldachin, or Italian baldacchino, is a large Baroque sculpted bronze canopy. Technically it's called a ciborium, or a baldachin, over the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. It dominates the center of the crossing and directly under the dome. Designed by the sculptor and architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini, it was intended to mark in a monumental way the place of St. Peter's tomb underneath, which you can see when you walk around and look down into the hole in the floor. The tomb can now be seen as visitors step behind the structure. Under the canopy is the high altar of the basilica. Commissioned by Pope Urban VIII, the work began in 1623 and ended in 1634. The baldachin acts as a visual focus within the basilica. It is a very large structure and forms a visual mediation between the enormous scale of the building and the human scale of the people. The baldachin is almost 100 feet high. It is gilded bronze. Some of the bronze used in this project was taken from the portico of the Pantheon, which is a structure from the 2nd century A.D. It is a dramatic presence in the crossing, especially the 4 spiral columns we call predecessors on the same spot. They are symbols of the Barberini family. Patron was Pope Urban VIII, who was Maffeo Barberini, so he came from that family. The spiral columns become a major focal point and will be copied all over Europe for the next 2 centuries. Here's a close-up to the curly columns with their little putti flying around. And here's a close-up of the Pope underneath the canopy. And here's Gian Lorenzo Bernini's David. The David from 1623 is a marble sculpture. It is about 5'7" tall, 7 inches tall. And the sculpture was part of a commission to decorate the villa of Bernini patron Cardinal Scipione Borghese. This gallery is called Galleria Borghese, where and this David is still there. It was completed in the course of only 7 months. The subject of the work is the biblical David, about to throw the stone that will bring down Goliath. This will allow David to behead him. The work is revolutionary in its implied motion, movement, and in its psychological depth. It shows expansive movement and displays a theatrical element. Time is very important here in that it shows a very determined David in the moment of action. The emotion-packed David moves through both time and space. He shows split-second action. This hero is not frozen in the action like Myron's discus thrower, or contemplative like Michelangelo's or Donatello's David. David is very concentrated. We experience a burst of energy. David cannot be confined to a niche. He is also not self-sufficient like Renaissance examples. So he's really its own entity. It shows us the main motif that we see so often in Baroque art, and this is the motif of the diagonal. Here's the very forceful face of David as he's very concentrated and trying to throw off this rock. Here's, as a comparison, the Michelangelo and the Donatello David. Now, Gian Lorenzo Bernini gets a very important commission for Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, and here in the Coronado Chapel. Bernini has knowledge of the theater and uses this knowledge to insert tension into his art. These ideas correlate with the ideas of Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order in 1534. He argued that the recreation of spiritual experience would increase devotion and piety. Bernini does not limit himself to firmly defined spatial settings. He uses architecture and sculpture to stage a theatrical setting. Saint Teresa was a Carmelite nun and one of the revered saints of the Spanish Counter-Reformation. After the death of her father, she fell into a series of trances and saw visions. She felt severe pain attributed to the fire-tipped arrows of divine love. Bernini's vision of Saint Teresa shows spiritual and physical passion. The two central sculptural figures of the swooning nun and the angel with the spear derived from an episode described by Teresa of Avila, this Carmelite nun that we just mentioned, and her autobiography. The autobiography was called The Life of Teresa and of Jesus. Her experience of religious ecstasy in her encounter with the angel is described as follows, quote, I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, and at the iron's point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God. The pain is not bodily, but spiritual. Though the body has its share in it. It is caressing of love, so sweet, which now takes place between the soul and God, that I pray God of his goodness to make him experience it, who may think that I am lying. End of quote. So Bernini shows us here this nun in a trance similar to a person reaching a sexual zenith. The supernatural event of Teresa's vision is raised to a sphere of its own. Removal from the beholder. It's removed from the beholder and from the onlookers of the Coronado family, which were on the sidelines of this vision in this relief. They were depicted in a group. The whole group floats, it levitates, and the golden rays of light come down from the heavens and from God. He actually made a design that included a window opening right above this sculptural group that would provide the group with natural lighting that would enhance the golden rays of light that come from above. Here's a close-up of Teresa's face, and you really see a very ecstatic rendering of this nun. Now let's talk about Francesco Borromini. He was the son of the stonemason Giovanni Domenico Castelli. He was born in Lugano, in the Italian part of Switzerland. Borromini began his career as a stonemason himself and soon moved to Milan. He moved to Rome in 1619 and changed his name from Castelli to Borromini. There he started to work for Carlo Maderno, his distant relative at St. Peter's. Now we've seen a large structure from this period already, and that was St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. Now let's look at a smaller scale of a religious building, and this is a wonderful example here. San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, which is a church dedicated to St. Charles, a famous plague saint, and is located near four fountains in the city of Rome, hence the name. This small church is considered by many an iconic masterpiece of Roman Baroque. Borromini avoided linear classicism and the simple circular shape in favor of the corrugated oval, and we will see this probably better on a later slide. If we look at the facade, we see that it consists of three vertical elements that seem to be swinging back and forth. And this is, I think, best seen if you look at the bottom where the street meets the architecture, and you actually see it swing back and forth and back again. If we look at the facade, this undulating movement is characteristic for the entire structure. The middle risalit curves out, as we can see by the curvature of the stairs leading into the church. From this vantage point, the curvature of the facade does not look too extreme, but as we will see in a later slide, it actually is quite noticeable. We see a two-story elevation and a large cartouche on the top in an oval shape. The inside shows an oval dome that is coffered. The coffers are arranged in a system of crosses and octagons that diminishes towards the lantern. The lantern is this element in the middle that anchors down the dome and that provides light. Now, if we look at the plan of the structure, we see that the church is small. Its complex, concave, convex rhythms disrupt the oval of the nave. Borromini designed the walls to weave in and out as they were formed, not of stone but of pliant substance set in motion by an energetic space. Now, let's see where the undulating motion is, and I hope I can do this with my pen tool here. So we have the undulating facade right here. It goes in and out and in again, right? And then we have this undulating motion in here that goes out and in and out and in, out and in, out and in. And there we have it. So you see this whole thing swing about quite a bit, which is very, very interesting. Just as the facade shows an undulating motion of concave and convex curves, the inside does as well. We get the impression that there are three-dimensional effects on two levels. And here is a photograph where we step very close to the facade and look up. And here you actually see how extreme the curvature of the facade really is. Now let's talk about Annibale Carracci, about the Carracci family in Bologna. Annibale Carracci was a pioneer of landscape painting. He was one of the first Baroque artists to paint a picture where the landscape took importance over the figures and narratives, as we see here in his Flight to Egypt from 1604. The painting is one out of a commission of 6 paintings in lunettes. At first glance, the painting looks like a landscape painting, with the vedutta of a town on a rolling hill in the middle of the piece. Only after some contemplation we see the Holy Family at a very small scale on their way to their Egyptian exile. Carracci is one of the first to put increased emphasis on the landscape aspect of painting. The narrative takes a back seat over his love of landscape depiction. His way of viewing landscape will have great influence on later artists such as Domenichino and Nicolas Poussin. Now, let's talk a little bit about ceiling frescoes. And before I discuss a ceiling fresco by Annibale Carracci, we should start out with a very famous one that we've seen earlier, and that is Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. And we still have this, hopefully, in the back of our minds. And here it is, our view from about 1512. we have already seen Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling and discussed what it took to make this difficult project. Michelangelo opts to design an architectural framework which he populates with figures and scenes. Annibale Carracci knows this famous work and uses it as an inspiration for one of his ceiling frescoes in Rome. This one here, the Loves of the Gods, in the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. Cardinal Odoardo Farnese commissioned this ceiling fresco for the wedding of his brother. It shows the loves of the gods, earthly and divine love in classical mythology. Annibale Carracci paints framed easel paintings on a ceiling here. These types of paintings are called quadri riportati. In these framed paintings, he tells us the story of love and involvement of gods and humans, with an emphasis on the pleasurable aspects of love, while he shows us even light in the scenes themselves. The outside figures in the painted frames are lit from below. So let's see if we can see that. Probably best in this one here that shows Diana and Endymion, where you see that light for the stucco figures on the outside seems to come from below, whereas the light in the scene itself comes probably from the upper left portion of the painting. This makes for some interesting visual solutions. While the scenes are self-contained, the lighting situation of the frame is firmly at home in reality, and here in particular in the reality of the viewer. Light seems to emanate from below where the wedding party would have sat, probably in a sea of candles, with their light radiating upward. Annibale developed hundreds of preparatory sketches for this major work. The narratives are framed in the restrained classicism of high Renaissance decoration, drawing inspiration from yet more immediate and more the more intimate Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, as well as Raphael's Loggia and the Farnesina frescoes that we've seen before. All figures are idealized and portray types. The color palette is light and upbeat. This particular brand of idealism that Annibale Carracci produced was a great contrast to other people such as Caravaggio, who was at home at the other end of the spectrum with his very own personal form of hyper-realism. But let's stay with ceiling painting for a while, and let's see if we can observe some sort of tendency in this genre over the period of about 200 years. We've already talked about Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling and Annibale Carracci's fresco in the Palazzo Farnese. Now let's make another jump in time and move on. Let's talk about Pietro da Cortona and his divine providence that he paints, that he fills the ceiling of the Grand Salon of the Palazzo Barberini in Rome with. It was begun in 1633 and was nearly finished in 3 years. Upon Cortona's return from Venice, it was extensively reworked and completed in 1639. The palazzo, since the 1620s, has been the palatial home of the Barberini family. At that time, the head of the family was Maffeo Barberini, who later became Pope Urban VIII, and we've already mentioned him. In his papacy, in his capacity as Pope, he launched an extensive program of refurbishment for the city. In this artwork, we see a lot of suns and bees. The Barberini family crest has 3 bees in it. At one end of the sky sits the eminent solar divine providence. At the other end are putti, putti and flying maidens holding the papal keys, a tiara with robe built and above a swarm of heraldic giant golden bees. This is where this is taking place. Some art historians have suggested that the goal of the fresco was to portray the Barberini papal election. There had been rumors that it had been rigged. If this was indeed so, the fresco here would act as a piece of political propaganda, trying to see Pope Urban VIII and his election as divine providence. Frescoes showing framed episodes called quadri riportati, as we see here, were found in Rome of that period quite often. We've just seen the Carracci example. The technique used here is called quadratura. Baldassare Peruzzi had pioneered this style of painting, in which the fresco replaces or simulates some of the architectural framework, using often forced perspective designed to trick the eye. This is a tendency that will become more and more pronounced as we progress in time. With Andrea Pozzo, we come to the end of the 17th century and the development in ceiling fresco paintings. He was an Italian Jesuit painter, architect and stage designer, and also an art theoretician. He also uses the quadratura technique when he mixes illusionistic architecture with other elements. He was born in Trento and died in Vienna. At age 17, he enters a humanist school run by Jesuits in his hometown. He might have received early artistic training from Palma Giovane. After 3 years, he travels to Como and Milan, and on December 25th, 1665, he enters the Jesuit order as a lay brother. Later in his life, he was inspired by Rubens. His artistic activity was related to the new order's enormous artistic needs. Since many of the Jesuit churches were built in recent decades, they were devoid of painted decoration. In 1681, he was called to Rome as a biblical stage designer for Livio Odescalchi, the powerful nephew of the new Pope Innocent XI. In 1702, he moves to Vienna, where he will work for Prince Johann Adam von Liechtenstein. Pozzo published his artistic ideas in a noted theoretical work entitled Perspectiva Pictorum et Architectorum. In it, he offered instruction in painting, architectural perspectives, and stage sets. The work was one of the earliest manuals on perspective for artists and architects and went into many editions. Gozzo's glorification of St. Ignatius, which we see here in Rome, is his masterpiece. The illusionistic perspectives in this painting of the dome and the apse and the ceiling of Rome's Jesuit church of St. Ignacio were painted between 1685 and 1694 and were a remarkable and emblematic creation of high Roman Baroque. For several generations, they set the standard for the decoration of late Baroque ceiling frescoes throughout Catholic Europe. On the flat ceiling, he painted an allegory of the apotheosis of St. Ignatius, or the triumph of the missionary efforts of the Jesuits. In breathtaking perspective, the painting, 17 meters in diameter, is devised to make an observer looking from a spot marked by a brass disc set into the floor of the nave seem to see a lofty vaulted opening decorated by statues, while in fact the ceiling is flat. The painting celebrates the missionary spirit of 2 centuries of adventurous apostolic spirit of Jesuit explorers and missionaries. To modern sensitivities, this would appear to substantiate the imperialistic partnering of European Catholicism with colonial enterprises in other continents. It was also a combative brand of Catholicism. So what we see here really is quadratura architecture, painted as a framework that starts to extend into the heavenly skies. And then in the middle we see an opening into open sky with lots of clouds and people floating about there. There are lots of protagonists here that seem to levitate in this space free of any gravitational forces. Now in this day and age, by the late 17th century, Pozzo usually would come in with a crew of people, and he would have a crew of specialists who would only work on the quadratura, only on these architectural frame settings here. Those would be experts in linear perspective. And then after this work was done, another crew of artists would come in and just work out the heavenly creatures and the clouds and the people floating about here. So it was a highly specialized work environment for artists here. And everybody seemed to have had their place. Now, if we look at this is a painting of a simulated dome from 1703. We see that the architecture of the trompe-l'oeil dome seems to erase and raise the ceiling with such a realistic impression that it is difficult to distinguish what is real and what is not. Andrea Pozzo painted this ceiling on canvas. Pozzo proposed to make an illusionistic dome. When viewed from inside, by painting on canvas that was ultimately glued to the ceiling. Painted architectural solutions like this were much cheaper than actual architecture. The painted dome was impressive to viewers but controversial. Some feared the canvas would soon darken. The viewer has to stand on a marked tile to get the right impression and have the optical illusion become convincing. When moving away from this one spot, one can observe that the dome starts to tilt. Now that we have undertaken an overview over the development of ceiling painting within a time frame of about 200 years, we should go back to the Carracci family and talk about the seismic shift in the educational field. Annibale Carracci, we said, was born in Bologna into a family of painters. In 1582, Annibale, Agostino, and their cousin Lodovico opened a studio called Accademia dei Desiderosi in Bologna. This new way of education in the field of the arts will be revolutionary for centuries to come. The Carracci family leaves behind the medieval workshop tradition in favor of the more modern approach of an academy. They developed their own curriculum, while the Carraccis laid emphasis on the typically Florentine linear draftsmanship. They also paid attention to the achievements of Venetian painters and their attention to glimmering colors. This eclecticism would define artists of the Baroque Emilian and Bolognese school and increase the family's fame and fortunes. The system of the Academy would allow the larger-than-life talent of Annibale to concentrate 100% of his time on painting, while his brother and cousin would run the school back home in Bologna, do the administrative tasks, and deal with an ever-increasing number of students. The Bolognese Academy was the first significant institution of its kind in Western art. It was founded on the idea that art can be taught in a classroom setting. In their curriculum, the Carracci Academy focused on a classical style with an emphasis on drawing. This will remain a cornerstone of art education for centuries to come. Thank you very much.